listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika. Okay, so when we were talking about the Trash Talk series, and in one of our conversations, I remember we were discussing garbage. And I told you about how I immediately thought of growing up in Gurgaon in the 90s because we had a home composter.
No one had a home composter then, Deepika. How did you have one?
We were oddballs. But no, my father and one of his close friends, Keshav Jaini, were experimenting with how to be green, and that's how this composter landed up at home. And my grandmother at the time was very upset, I remember, because for her, garbage had to be something that was outside the house. It wasn't supposed to be indoors. And there'd always be this tussle about, is it inside or outside? And it became this matter of great debate.
But I also remember that you told me much later that Keshav uncle, your father's best friend, actually has now converted his entire community to composting, which is quite fabulous. And it worked perfectly for us.
Yeah, and so that's why I wanted to go and meet him and find out how that happened. And that's what brought me to Garden Estate in Gurgaon after all these years.
My name is Keshav Jaini. I live in Garden Estate, Gurgaon. This is a complex of 373 houses and flats with a total area of 23 acres. And we have roughly about 1,800 people, including all the staff and everything living here.
Yes, so 373 households, that's quite a bit. And I remember that we then began exploring who else had been doing community composting at the apartment level. And literally the first outcome of the Google search was Savita, who actually lives in my city, Bangalore.
Yeah, so Savita Hiremath lives in Yelahanka in Bangalore, and she started this website called Endlessly Green, where she's documented her experiences of community composting and how that happens. And she herself has been one of the key people in her society to ensure that community composting takes place. So, I had to go and meet her.
Yeah, I'm Savita Hiremath. I live in Yelahanka, Bangalore, which is northern part of the city. And my apartment name is Shobha Althea Azalea. It's sort of a suburban area, much quieter and greener. And we here in our community, we have 202 homes. This whole thing is perching on 8-acre plot.
So this one's in North Bangalore and much smaller in terms of size of plot and the number of people. But to begin at the beginning, how did they even begin to get involved in the process of composting at such scales? Do they have some background in these activities?
Well, it was different things for both of them. And I think for Keshav uncle, like I said, he had an inclination towards, experimenting with different sorts of ways of living closer to the earth. And at the time, he had begun thinking about garbage at the community level when he had his twin daughters.
So when my twin daughters were about 5 years old, we moved to Garden Estate, and then we realized that even though it's a very clean place and there are not many people living as yet, but over time it would start getting dirty. So we started a Sunday cleanup with my daughters and their friends, and we would just go around and pick up a little bit of litter. The idea was not about cleaning up the place. The idea was more in terms of really getting the kids to understand that they should not litter. So that's how it started. And then over the years, I got involved with solar work, then got into doing my own composting, my own segregation. And wherever I went, it used to sort of, I would just see litter and wonder, why can't we just find solutions for this? About 4 years ago, I was walking with my president in Garden Estate, and I was telling him how, I'm so environment friendly. I do my own segregation and I do my own composting. So he turns around and looks at me and says, but what's so great? You've got to do it for the community. Then it matters. And then I started thinking, because my impact is too little. And if I really want to do something, I've got to create a positive impact on the planet, not just reduce my negative impact by like switching off the light or, not using a plastic straw or something. You have to do a lot more, way beyond that as an individual to transform yourself and transform your community.
And at the time, he also said it was a really difficult task because how do you convince everybody living in your community that this is something, it's a direction to go in? And, so when he was quite nervous about that, so he went and he met other people who'd done it, somebody in Bangalore, incidentally. He went for a permaculture course, and that's how he began his journey.
But what about Savita?
Oh, Savita had completely different beginnings. I mean, she was living in an apartment called Brigade Regency. And then back in 2009, there was a huge push for segregation there. But, and she was telling me that as a young mother and a mother to a very young child also working, it was the last thing that she wanted to do because it just meant extra work.
I got my first lessons in segregation in that community. Believe it or not, I was really upset when they started the whole thing because I thought it was too much of an extra work. I thought, who's going to do so much? And because they were asking us to segregate everything into 6 categories every day. And that I thought was too much. Okay. And I started rationalizing all my excuses in my own way. I have just a 2-year-old kid. What am I going to do? I'm a working woman, this, that, all those things. But I must say that just within a week, since we started, it was mandatory, so we had to do, and I started doing. But within a week, I realized it was really not at all such a big deal as I thought it would be, And everything started falling in place, and I just figured out it's sort of, it takes just 1 or 2 seconds of thought as to, okay, which bin is it going into? Because there were 6 of them. So naturally, it was a bit of work. But within a week, we sort of, everybody in the house, we got used to it. And we never went wrong with segregation. That's how this whole thing began. But I knew nothing about composting back then. Then, again, back in Brigade Regency, I didn't involve, once they came and gave a packet full of compost to those who were doing some gardening in their balcony. I had a few plants. So they gave it to us also. So I was like, okay, this was my kitchen waste and this is how it comes back. That was my first impression about such a very beautifully looking black compost that they gave. But that's about it. And we moved here. We bought a flat in Yelahanka. We moved here, and then just a couple of months after I came here, I realized that segregation wasn't going well. It was only done into 2 categories, which is wrong. But still, there was something in place, and that was the good thing about it. Segregation was going on, but they needed much more to be done because the composting setup was not doing well. And then, some people somehow through some conversation, they came to know that I have done some work in segregation, and they asked me whether I could help with it. So I jumped into it. That's how it all began. But my knowledge was pretty much limited to segregation alone. The categories, where it can go, who can buy the, segregated waste, all those things I knew. But I knew literally nothing about composting. That was the beginning.
So as a Bangalorean, I remember why this push for segregation came. Because, before the 90s, Bangalore was just a sleepy little town and was known as the Garden City. But post early 90s and through the 2000s, population went from literally 6 million in 2001 to 10 million in 2011, which is almost a 47% growth in a decade. And I remember in 2012, in particular, newspapers were filled with articles on garbage because garbage was literally everywhere. The BBMP was completely out of its depth and it had no way of coping with the kind of copious amounts of garbage that the city was producing.
Yeah, and I remember traveling to Bangalore around that time, and my memory actually is of the smell of it because it would be burnt at every street corner. And that the kind that coats your tongue and, makes the back of your throat itch. It was that smell that I remember from visiting the city then.
Yeah, so then it finally led to the municipal solid waste rules in 2012, and they were notified by the BBMP. And this gave actually a lot of the concerned citizens the support they required to push segregation within their communities.
Yeah, and that's what Savita said, that, gave them something to stand up in their societies with their RWAs and say, no, there is a law backing this, and that's why we also need to take this work forward.
It was the same time when, in 2012 October, when the first BBMP legislation, the first of its kind in India, it came out saying that you should segregate at your source and you should also compost. That was the legislation. So we in the community, the management community, everybody, all of us made use of that. We exploited that legislation to the core. And then we said, look, this is the thing. Now we have to start segregating. So we have to start composting everything, this, all those things. So we started, earlier it was being done into 2 categories. Now we started doing 3 categories. One is kitchen waste, anything organic waste, garden waste also from your balcony and all. And secondly, dry waste, which includes dry, clean plastic, paper, your electronic waste, metal waste, anything that can be recycled, but it should be kept clean. Third one is the waste that can be incinerated, like infected waste, sanitary napkins, diapers, medical waste, hospital waste, whatever that in case comes in, and all that goes into the last red bin. That is the one. We didn't do color coding back then because it was not in vogue. Now we have a high court ruling on that, 2 bin 1 bag ruling. But back then it wasn't there, but still it was okay. We managed it very well. That was it. And then segregation, we achieved very high levels of segregation, high compliance rate within a matter of 1 week. There were confusions and all that. People would approach me and some other volunteers who were also working with me for this cause. And then, we kept on. We were very much in touch with the community through email and through WhatsApp, whatever was working then, all the communication modes we used.
In 2015, then the Karnataka High Court mandated the 2 bin 1 bag system. So everybody had to start segregating their waste into these 3 categories.
Was it the same for Keshav uncle in Gurgaon though?
He didn't have the advantage of a law. So for him, it meant getting a bunch of people on board who'd never actually had to think about their garbage once it left their house, because there'd be people to come and whisk it away. And so for him, he had to go from that place to making it something that everybody had to take responsibility for.
When I came back, I still realized that it's not easy to, convince 1,800 people. So how do you do that? So I decided to go by a simple process of doing a pilot project. I discussed it with my president, told him that let's find 20 houses and we'll do composting and segregation for 20 houses. So he gave me the go-ahead. We set up the first pilot project, saw it through, realized what are the problems we face, what are the successes we're getting, and then did the whole cycle again once. Because in a building, you have different problems about how you pick up the waste, who picks it up, where does he take it, where will you compost. So all these things came in. And while composting also, what are the issues that you would face? So the other thing I did was create a lot of awareness. Since I've been living here for a long time, I met a lot of people, told them this is what we need to do, and we are looking at doing this project. But we've started a pilot. So whoever I could talk to, I would talk to them, kids, adults, the workers, and slowly told them the pilot's going on in that corner. Come see it whenever you want. So when the first time we were going to take out the compost, I told everybody I'd been talking to, please come, let's have a look. And when the black gold came out of it, people were convinced that, look, we're going in the right way. So the pilot was a very important part of it. And the second was, of course, awareness. It's very important that the community must be taken together to make these things work. It cannot be driven by 1 or 2 people. It has to be driven by the community, feeling a sense of involvement and a stake in the whole thing.
And then they also implemented the 2 bin 1 bag system, because without that proper segregation, the next step of composting isn't possible.
The catch here is, unless it's clean and dry, nobody will do anything with it. It'll just go throw into the landfill. So it has to be clean and dry, segregated and stocked. Once you have quantity, you can find a person who will be interested. If you have 2 pieces of plastic bag, nobody is going to do anything. It's just going to go into the landfill. Again, it's a question of monetary benefit to the waste picker. If there is money in it, then only he'll segregate it at the second source and then take it somewhere to sell it. So that market keeps fluctuating a lot. But if you give him enough quantity, properly segregated, he'll still find that it's possible. But if you make him sit down and segregate stuff which is filthy, he's only going to take out the best things which he can sell. Even things which could have been sold if they had been properly segregated and cleaned and kept dry, those he will not touch because the value is not enough for his work. And it's not fair. We should not have any waste picker going through our filth there, our trash. It is our responsibility. We must do it the correct way.
What I find interesting is that in both Keshav uncle and Savita's narrative, it begins with this deep sense of personal responsibility, and then it seems to have traveled to this place of deep commitment to the community process.
And I think that comes across quite strongly because that engagement is critical, right? And it takes energy and effort, and you need the support and conviction also of the community to take an idea forward. But I think the work, and from the sense I got from talking to them, was that they just get a lot of pleasure and joy in doing it. And, both of them almost ecstatic about compost. And yeah, and when you see something that's otherwise waste going to a landfill being converted into soil, it's a pretty, heady high in that sense. And that's really what I remember feeling when I was talking to both of them.
And I think we're going to have to capture some of this in part B of this conversation, because it's really fantastic the way they think and the way they've thought about it, the way their journey has been traversed. But the other question that I had as I was listening to them and to you was that, it just seems all too tidy and neat till now. There must have been resistances because, Savita herself had resistances in the beginning. So what about the community at large?
Yeah, they did. And there was, I think, plenty of them, from being told that it was too smelly and too much work to, we don't have enough space for it, to, Keshav uncle offering to go to people's houses to train their maids if they couldn't do it themselves. And then once you have the compost, and literally if you're talking about a society with 300 and 400 households, it's tons of compost. And what do you do with it? Where does it go? So these were all very real questions that they had to deal with in this process.
Human beings are what they are, and we are not ready for change. Any kind of change is tough, and change regarding waste is quite impossible. So a couple of issues we faced. They said, we can't tell our maid servants to do it. They will not do it. And then who will do it? So I said, this is your responsibility. Find a solution to it. If you can't do it, I will come and segregate for a week for you. Train your maid individually so that she understands. I got a better response from the maids and the workers in the house than actually the residents. Because the residents somehow have this feeling that it's not our job. And they don't want to tell their servants in the house that it's their job to segregate. But the sessions I did with the workers were far more fruitful than the ones I did with the residents. So the major problem I really faced was apathy. Everybody just said, forget it, it's not important. And that's what I really had to get around. So then the way I did that was I worked a lot with the children, got them involved, and they were able to, move it further. So I'll tell you an incident. I was sort of one day walking and I was just feeling that, am I getting anywhere with all this? And there was this young kid cycling away to glory. And he shouts from the, Keshav uncle, we are segregating. My house is segregating. And that started me again. So it worked well.
See, mainly some of the resistance came from people who really thought they were neatniks, okay? We don't want like this. We don't want to keep our, for instance, dry waste for 1 week or so. It has to be taken out every day. We are very scared of, rats and other rodents attacking the bins kept outside in the corridor for a long time. All these issues, because earlier they used to tie it up in black plastic bags. Now no tying. We were very clear that don't tie it up, because once you do it, you're hiding something. Okay, when you keep it in the open, out in the open, you're very sure of your segregation quality, and we don't have to worry about it. Open in the sense you can keep the lid, we're not saying, but something that can be taken out easily. So there were resistance, there were many people who resisted, but I must say that those who didn't were in majority.
So I have been composting for a while now too, though at an individual capacity. And I remember, like in your house in the 90s, when I first sort of declared it to my parents that we were going to compost, they had the same reaction. They wondered, what about the smell, cleanliness, and I think especially the soldier fly maggots. I think that freaks everyone out because they're not fine to look at and have around, but questions like, aren't we inviting disease into the house and all of that. But I think the approach that possibly is the approach to take is what Keshav uncle and Savita have shown us, that these are challenges to be overcome, not necessarily the place where you stop. You just keep going on and figure your way around these things. So an enormous amount of effort has gone to educate and engage the communities, right? And they're now on board and the waste is getting segregated. What happens next?
Well, then the conversation shifted to what do you do with that waste, right? So you have to identify spaces for it. And in Garden Estate in Gurgaon, they identified an area where these steel wire mesh bins were kept. So that's where the wet waste was put into. And then next to it was a space to again sort out your newspapers and your plastic bottles. And then adjacent to that was a place to keep compost. And in Savita Society, again, was a space identified under this ramp that leads up to the main driveway. And there's just stacks and stacks of compost kept there. And then, of course, I think it comes down to, as both of them say, the denizens of the earth, the microbes and, them doing their work. And Savita was explaining that quite beautifully.
And it takes many batches of bacteria and fungi to come and do the job. It progresses in a very, very staged manner. It's like a big orchestra going on there. And there is a certain set of bacteria come in at they come and do the job in the beginning, and they are very comfortable at 32 degrees centigrade. And then the temperature may go up beyond 70 degrees centigrade within that bin, believe it or not, in the core. And then it moves on to, then again it becomes cooler, and then that's when the composting has happened. But the announcement that the compost is ready is done by a half-breed microorganism, which is half bacteria and half fungi, called actinomycetes. And that comes and announces through a wonderful smell. It is the same smell that you get to, experience when it rains. It's the same half-breed microorganism that's also working in the soil. It's the same one that works in the compost as well.
So her knowledge and of the detail of science of composting is quite fascinating. And I think it just indicates to me also the huge effort that she's made in her journey. So Savita worked with an organization called Reap Benefit and the idea was to bring efficiency to the system of composting when you're looking at it at scale.
And I think you can sense that in this almost poetic quality that she has in her description, because that's how she's experienced it.
But the thing is that the more you think about composting and its requirements, it is the microbes that do the work. But in terms of infrastructure requirements, it's about studying what is available and what space you have, and therefore deciding how much to invest or what that cost might be.
Most people have a 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom flat. They have all the space for the eating, living, sleeping, air conditioners and fancy music systems. This costs a fraction of anything you can imagine. So a composting system for a family would cost about 2,000 to 3,000 rupees. And there are professional systems in the market. You can buy them, you can set it up. For communities, they can range from 3 lakhs to 10 lakhs to 20 lakhs, depending on the size, depending on the level of machinery you want to buy, the automation you want. But having said that, what we did in Garden Estate was a completely natural process. Who does the work of composting? It's the microbes who do it. It's not machines. It's not energy. It's not electricity that does it. So if you just create an atmosphere or an arrangement where you can collect the waste and let the microbes work on it, they'll do the job. You don't need to be doing labor. They have to do the labor. So in Garden Estate, we set up the simplest of system. And we spent only 50,000 rupees for our whole complex to set up our compost system, which is just a set of steel wire mesh bins in which we put in our kitchen waste along with horticulture waste, which is a combination of carbon and nitrogen, and let the microbes do their job and leave it alone.
So the costs aren't really very high at all.
No, the cost can be anything from 50,000 rupees to 8 lakh, depending on what you want to invest in. But again, it's really the microbes that do the work. And more than that, it's the belief that, and the idea and wanting to get it done.
On a daily basis, we get anything between 220 to 250 kilos of kitchen waste. So multiply that by about 1,000 days, because we've been doing this for over 1,000 days, and you have the quantity in 250, 300 tons. 10% to 15% of that is what you get as compost. So you're looking at least 25 tons of compost we make. This figure keeps changing because another 3 months from now, we'll have created more. And the good part is because we've got a lot of horticulture, most of this, 80% of the compost we make goes back to our own greenery. And 10% of it is actually bought by the residents and they have to pay for it. We charge 10 rupees a kilo for the compost we give them. And 10% is reserved for our CSR, which is community social responsibility. So we make sure that 10%, anybody, any park or anybody wants, we give it to them.
Once the composting system fell in place, we were doing 100% of recycling of that particular organic waste. And we composted whatever we can using whatever the infrastructure we had, all the garden waste that was cotton clippings and everything. But big branches and all that can't be done. We don't have that kind of this. It calls for industrial setups. So barring that, everything was getting composted here. And all the dry waste that came in. Usually what happens given in an urban setting, in a household like this, usually 60 to 65% of the waste is kitchen waste. And then another 30-35% is dry waste, that is paper, plastic and e-waste and all those things put together. Third one is 5 to 10% of your sanitary waste, which has to be incinerated actually, according to the law. But even if you don't do, by then you have already taken care of 90 to 95% of the waste, which can be completely recycled. So even if you are sending out, the last bit to the landfills, you're only sending out 5 to 10%. Initially, we started segregating the secondary segregation of the dry waste, paper, plastic, and all that. Our housekeepers would pick it up. They still do the same job. And they pick it up, go downstairs, and they start segregating it into various categories. And just within a few months, I came to know that we were segregating that into 22 to 24 categories. And I was like, really? Then you come to know so many categories of waste is being generated every day. Every little bit was nicely kept into different, dabbas and all that. And I was it was such a beautiful sight to see everything neatly sitting in its own place. And that fetches value. If you mix some dirty plastic with clean plastic loses value. No matter how good quality, what kind of quality it has. So segregation becomes very important to make sure that you get get some good value for all the work that you have done. They would line their bin with 3 plastic bags. One day, suddenly I sat down and started making a calculation about it. One house not sending out 3 plastic bags a day, multiply it in 200 households. Then it runs into thousands of plastic bags per year, close to, I think, 84,000 plastic bags. That much you are not bringing it into the community, from the stores. So much of plastic production is stopped. At least we didn't make use of those many plastic bags. This is how you start reducing waste generation.
So these stats are just amazing. 90% recycling, tons of waste converted to soil. And the 22 categories, I can't even wrap my head around. I mean, what are the 22 categories? Someone needs to list these. I mean, I don't know what to admire more, the people or the process.
Yeah, I don't think you have to pick one, but it is both those things. And, even I didn't know you could segregate into so many sections.
So, the thought that comes to my mind is that clearly they've been part of the process for a couple of years now, right? This has been going on for a couple of years?
Yeah, for both of them.
Yeah, so the question then is, how do you maintain systems like this? Because it sounds like it would be really hard for just a few people to do this.
It is, and I think both of them spoke to that and explained how it happens.
All the new volunteers keep coming in and they keep writing about what the current issues are and all that. And when the segregation levels are low, they restart the conversation and all that. But sort of, when the volunteers' commitment is high, then clean work is going on, So I keep telling everybody, even in my teams, the level of segregation, the quality of composting, everything that we do is directly proportional to the volunteers' commitment. If they are committed, everything goes on like clockwork. If they have half-hearted approach, then it suffers. So all communities go through this in a cyclical fashion, because no one person can do this job forever for any community, and nobody should be doing it actually, because it is everybody's job. Everybody must chip in. It can't be left to one person just because that person is passionate about it. That's something I learned quite late. I realized that no, this is not the way to go about it. You have to develop certain level of detachment, come out of it, let others do. But yeah, you are fortunate only if you have somebody who comes and matches at least half the level of your passion and take things forward. But human nature doesn't work like that. We have very, very different way of inheriting something and then sort of making sure that inheritance doesn't suffer losses. But still, it's okay. Whatever that's going on is at a certain level, which one should be satisfied with. Yeah.
So in the last couple of years, we've really not done much in terms of actual waste management for the kids or for anything, because the thing is stabilized to a certain level and we've left it alone. It also depends on the executive committee, the president, as to how much they want to enforce these things. If you get the feeling that they're not quite involved and want to push it, you also tend to take a little backseat and say, look, it's happening, let it go on the way it is, and let's not rock the boat too much. But having said that, if things start getting out of hand, then people get back to me and say, Keshav, this problem's coming in. So I look into it. I'm not on the board. I'm not really handling this now. But because most people understand it's a good thing, the composting is going very well, because that's 2 people working on it and checking with me for it. The segregation is at a slightly slower level because it's not being enforced enough, which we'll get back to. There are always ups and downs in whatever you do. So it's a cycle that continues.
No, when I was listening to both Keshav Uncle and Savita, what struck me was the amount of effort they've put into this and also how central their roles have been. But I don't think any of this would have worked out if they didn't have, the support that they did in terms of, people standing up to be green volunteers or, kids sort of encouraging them and, holding their hands when they were feeling low about something. It took a whole bunch of people to make this happen.
Absolutely. And, the thought that struck me was that I was just thinking what a huge difference it makes if you decentralize a process. And particularly for this process of waste segregation and management, right? Because when we were Googling, a whole lot of stats for this episode, we actually found these amazing, crazy numbers. 1,500 metric tons of waste solid waste is created by the city of Gurgaon every single day. And for Bangalore, it's 6,000 metric tons. And at that scale, you can't imagine, 6,000 metric tons and you try to compost or segregate. It sounds impossible. But then suddenly you hear Keshav Uncle speaking at his apartment level, at his complex level. And it's 200 kgs or it's 300 kgs. And it's doable, right? Because they're already doing it. They're showcasing the fact that it can be done. It's been converted to compost. And maybe the point that these stories make so beautifully is that maybe we don't need to look at the city level in some cases. Maybe we need to come closer home and begin to work there. And that's where change belongs.
To know more about different sorts of systems to compost at scale, visit Savita Hiremath's website at www.savitahiremath.com. It has a comprehensive list of all things composting. Or visit our website www.thecuriositycollective.org for a list of resources and people you can reach out to in different cities who can share their expertise on how to segregate and compost at scale. In our next conversation, we'll dive in deeper to understand what drives Keshav Jaini, Savita Hiremath, and a fellow compost enthusiast, Padma Patil, to do the community work they do. This episode has been made with the support of Srinidhi Raghavan and produced by the Bangalore Recording Company.